It is Tuesday, June 19th. My name is Herb Gronick, and I'm visiting with Eva Lipchik, and part of the Video History Project of the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society. I would like to start out by finding out a little bit about you, your full name, and when and where you were born.
Okay. Well, my name is Eva. I was given the name Eva, but everybody knows me as Eve since I came to the United States. And my maiden name is Steuer, S-T-E-U-E-R, which means tax.
Tax?
Tax.
Okay.
And my married name is Lipchik.
Okay. You've already answered a question that I was about to ask you, if your family name has a special meaning.
Oh, okay.
And so that is taking care of that.
Okay.
And were you the first family member to settle in this country? And when did you come here?
My mother and I came on May 23rd, 1940. And no one in our family had ever come and lived in the United States before. That is, until the Second World War, and some distant relatives from Vienna had preceded us to New York.
Where were you born?
I was born in Vienna.
And what brought you or them here? Which is a very obvious question,
Right.
I think.
Obviously, the fear of ending up in a concentration camp.
Yes. How did you get the money to come here? How did your mother get the money?
You know, I'm not really clear. I was 8 years old when we came, and I know that we only had $5. The Nazis only left $5 for traveling. But I think there must have been some bank accounts or something that the Jewish Community Center in Vienna helped people get transportation, you know, across the ocean and so forth, and train. So there must have been some money allowed us for that, because the Nazis were very anxious to get us out. At this point, they weren't deporting, they were only deporting the men. And I have to go back a little bit. My father left first. My father left in the end of 1938, and he went with a Kindertransport as a monitor to help, you know, take care of the children. But the idea was for him to leave so he wouldn't be imprisoned, and for him to get some way to get my mother and me out. I'm an only child. And my grandparents said, "You go. You know, we'll be safe. We're old. You go." And my mother's brother had left for Israel already, and my father's sister was in Paris at the time. So my mother and I, my father left, and my mother and I were left in Vienna, and then we were supposed to follow my father in September of 1939 to England. Now here's where my story is very confusing to me, because until I was 60 years old, I believed that September 8th, or whatever the date was when the Second World War broke out between Germany and England, that my mother and I were on our way to England. I always believed that we took a train to Italy, and my story was that we were told, even though the war broke out, we were supposed to fly, but we couldn't fly anymore. So go to Italy, cross the English Channel, and get from France to England. So that's the story I believed until I was 60 years old, until my mother told me at that point that when we left Vienna that time to go to Italy, we were going to go to Israel, to her brother and sister-in-law. And I don't know whether she was pretty old at the time, whether this is a confusion in her mind or whether they told me that story because I would have gotten hysterical about, I want to go to see my dad, I don't want to go to Israel. I don't know. My mother was, as I said, I don't know whose story is correct.
But your father was in...
My father went to England. My father was in England, and he stayed there. When he got there, he they had all the men in sort of a camp of some kind. And then when the war broke out, he had the choice of either joining the English army or going into some sort of a labor force. And he was an engineer. He joined the army. But then he had a nervous breakdown because he was so concerned about my mother and me still in Vienna. And he was released from the army. And he worked for Humbert Hillman in some sort of secret war work. And he eventually joined my mother and me in the United States in 1944. He came via Canada, from England to Canada and down to New York.
Was that possibly because of the quota system of who would be allowed in from England or from Germany, or was it a matter that it was easier to get in from Canada?
I really don't know the answer to that. Well, I don't think he could have gotten from England to the United States. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not sure if, because you were little, can you describe any of the build-up prior to World War II and how, if your life changed at all?
Oh my goodness.
From,
Of course. I was a happy little girl. I was the only child in the whole family. My father's sister never married. My mother's brother and his wife didn't have children until they went to Israel. So I was sort of the only child in the family, which had its good and bad sides. I had a couple of the second, third cousins, but immediate. I didn't have any first cousins, and we had a maid in the house until Hitler came. Every middle-class person had help in the home, but so there was somebody in the home, and life was just really nice. I went to school, and there was at the time, whatever religion you were, it was compulsory to take religious training as part of your public education. So I started school, I was born in 1931, I started school in 1937, so I had a year of Hebrew before Hitler came, and I went to Hebrew school. My family, I should mention, was totally assimilated. Nobody belonged to a synagogue. I had no idea about holidays. The only holiday that was celebrated was Yom Kippur, because my mother and my grandmother fasted, but I didn't know why. And my father's parents came from Poland and were quite religious there, but sort of emancipated themselves as a young couple, came to Vienna they were sort of intellectuals, and they came and didn't practice any religion. And my mother's side of the family came from Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and I don't know how religious they were, but nobody practiced. I didn't know anything about it. Our maids were, of course, not Jewish, but I remember having a Christmas tree a couple of years when I was small. And when then Hitler came, marched in, and overnight, the next morning when my mother took me to school, instead of her mixing with all the ladies, such as she usually did, the moms talked and the kids waited for the school to open, they all sort of were distant, and my mother and I stood alone. When I woke up that morning, I looked out the window, and all the windows across the street had flags with swastikas draped over them, and my parents explained to me what had happened, that the Germans had marched in. So school changed. I I stayed in that school for a while. They didn't separate us into Jewish schools for about probably a year, or close to a year. But while I was in this mixed school, it was, the Jewish children were not allowed to make cards for the Führer for his birthday. We had to get up when the principal walked in, or another teacher, you know, it was back in the 30s, you got up when any adult walked in, but we were not allowed to say Heil Hitler. We had to, and you know, it was like, oh, you know, I'm being excluded. You didn't, at 6 it felt like, wow, well, why can't I do what everybody else is doing? And in the park, things changed. When I went to the park, we lived in the, you know, it was an urban setting, and people went to parks. And within a week or two, there were signs on the benches, Jews forbidden. Very shortly thereafter, the signs came on the stores. My mother bought me candy at a special store all the time. Signs on the stores, Jews forbidden. Well, my mother was very spunky, and she, I don't know, she was light-haired, and she wasn't afraid. She would go in and buy candy anyway and take a chance and buy me candy.
What did your father do?
My father was an engineer, a mechanical engineer.
And did he work for a company there? Or?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And your folks were brought up not in Vienna at all. How did they?
No, they were born.
Oh,
they were born in Vienna. Both my parents were born in
Oh,
Vienna.
the grandparents.
My grandparents were not.
Okay, now I understand.
Yeah.
Yes. The neighborhood in which you were brought up prior to the Hitler regime, then, was it a Jewish neighborhood as such, or was it a mixed neighborhood?
Well, it's very interesting. I don't know how long this interview can last, but I have sort of an interesting story about that. The district that we lived in was actually a Jewish district. It was not the Jewish district where Orthodox people lived as well, but apparently, and I didn't know that until the 90s, when professionally I began to go back to Vienna to teach. Apparently the district I lived in had many Jewish people, and there was a very famous synagogue that was destroyed in November.
1938?
Yeah. I didn't know about those things because we didn't belong to the synagogue. But the district was Jewish, and my parents' friends were all Jewish. And the kids that I knew from school, I don't know whether they were, I suspect they were also all Jewish, because when I think about it, they left one by one and they emigrated, you know. So I guess the friends I went to school with, and then of course when we moved to Jewish schools, when we were separated out into Jewish schools. But it was a Jewish area, as I now know, but didn't realize then.
Were your parents involved in Jewish communal work?
My father was a member of the Jewish war veterans from the First World War, but otherwise, no. Not that I know of.
Okay. Was there anything there that was typically Jewish traditions in the area in which you grew up, or in your family as such?
The only thing was that the grandma and mom fasted on Yom Kippur.
Did your grandma live with you?
No.
No.
They lived in a building across the street. My grandfather was a dentist, and they lived like across the street in an apartment building.
Okay. And were you, of course you were only 6 years old, and so you were not involved.
When Hitler came.
Yeah, but you were not involved in anything of Jewish activities of
Well, I went to Hebrew school.
yeah, but I mean of clubs or anything.
Oh yeah, I went. They took me to the Maccabees to get swimming lessons. Yes.
Okay, and of course the other thing, You were not aware of the anti-Semitism that,
Yes, I was.
I mean, you were.
I was very aware of it.
In what way?
First of all, as I explained, in the parks, not being able to sit on benches and play, being ostracized by friends, being separated in the school. But on the street, I mean, I had situations, for instance, where I remember my mother met a friend on the street, and they talked, and I was like a little kid, so I'm looking around at people as they passed, waiting for my mother to finish her conversation, and a woman passed by, and I must have looked at her like a kid looks at somebody, and she spit in my face and said, "Don't look at me, you Jewish brat," something like that. There was
Were
great.
there any markers that indicated
No,
that you were Jewish?
no, but we did have to observe a curfew by 1939, and we couldn't go out after a certain time in the evening. I did not have to wear a star yet, but I guess, I don't know, maybe I looked Jewish or whatever, I don't know.
Well then, were you aware of your mother being ostracized?
Oh, of course, yeah. What happened was that after my father left, the Gestapo began to consolidate the Jews, and we gave up our apartment, or they took it. I really don't know whether they took my parents' apartment, or whether I don't know what happened exactly. But we moved in with my grandparents, because what was happening, the Gestapo was taking the Jews and putting as many as possible into one apartment, and taking the other nice apartments for themselves. So we moved in with my grandparents, and again my mother showed a tremendous amount of spunk. I remember standing there as the Gestapo came to the door and inspected the apartment and said, "How many people live here?" And it was at the time just my grandparents and my mother and I, and they said, "Okay, we're going to put in 2 more families here." And my mother said to the Gestapo, I remember it so distinctly, she said to this, it was a very young guy, he said, "Do you have parents?" And he said, "Yeah, of course I have parents." She said, "Would you want your parents to have to give up their bedroom when they're 75 years old, like my parents?" And he said, "Okay." So they just, instead of putting 2 families in, they put 1 single man into the apartment. And so there were just 5 of us living there, So my grandparents kept their bedroom. My mother and I slept in my grandfather's office where he practiced. And this single man got the living room and slept there.
What do you recall about the Kristallnacht?
I have one memory, and I don't know if that's the Kristallnacht. I know that there were windows broken on the street. Oh, and one thing that began to happen right away as I talk to you, this keeps coming back. We lived on the top floor of our apartment building, and it's almost like every second, after a month or 2 or 3, every time we get up in the morning, somebody would have painted with oil paint the words Jude on our front door. And we would take it off, we'd get turpentine and put it off, and then it would happen again, and it happened all the time. And that was a constant. And then I have this memory of looking out our window and seeing some men scrub the word Jude off the streets that somebody had painted with oil paint. Jewish men had to get down on their knees and scrub that off the street, and I remember that. And I don't know if that was on right after Kristallnacht, because I remember some broken store windows and things. But
is there anything else that you could tell us about your experience at that time in Vienna, or is it a matter of coming to America that would further enlighten us.
Well, I remember how food became a shortage, and I remember how my mother learned from another friend that if you have a cauliflower, you don't throw away the greens. You can make a vegetable out of the greens, and it was very frightening. It was hard. It was fearful. I was scared to be on the streets, and you never knew what might happen. And my grandparents, of course, weren't going to go with us, and my mother managed to get us out by just even before Hitler marched in. She was a big warrior and had a lot of anxiety, and it paid off because she kept saying, we've got to get out of here if Hitler comes. And the whole family said, oh, please stop worrying. You know, the Jews are living in Germany, they're segregated, but it'll all blow over. And my mother wouldn't accept that. So what she did is she went to the Jewish Community Center and talked to them, and they suggested if we don't have relatives in the United States, go to the post office and look at phone books, American phone books, and see if the name Steuer is in any of them. So my mother wrote to a Steuer in Boston, who happened to have been dead already for years because they were old phone books. His daughter got it. She was a widow, and she sent the letter to her sister who lived in Jamaica Estates in New York, who had a son my age, and they decided to provide an affidavit for us, and that's how we got out of Vienna.
Now, to understand correctly, you went directly from Vienna.
You
came directly from Vienna to the United States.
Well, the first, I'm sorry, the story may sound a little confusing, but I told you the first time I thought I was going to England in 1938. Well, when we tried that, we did go to Italy. We went to Italy, we said goodbye to the grandparents, we got on a train, and when we got to the Italian border, the Gestapo stopped us and put us in prison overnight and sent us back to Vienna and said we're all going to go to a concentration camp. But my mother had connections at the Jewish Community Center. They were very supportive, and we weren't deported, but we were put on probation. So she and I every week had to report to the Gestapo what our progress was for getting out of Vienna.
How long a time was it from the time you started, that your mother started to make arrangements to come before you actually came?
Probably 2 years.
Probably 2 years.
Yeah.
And when you came here, you landed in New York?
In New York, and these people picked us up.
The Steuyers.
Their name wasn't Steuer. The maiden name was Steuer. Their name was Robbins. They picked us up. They were very well-to-do people, and they had a car, and they picked us up at the boat in New York, not at Ellis Island, at the harbor in New York, and they took us to their home. They had an African-American maid and pink toilet paper, and there was the bell jangled after dinner, and then ice cream truck came with ice cream. I mean, it was just the first thing I ate in the United States was an Eskimo pie that was bought for me as I got off the boat. I mean, it was just, and I felt so safe. You know, it felt so good.
By that time, your age was about 8.
I was. It was May, and I turned 9 in August.
You went to school in New York then,
Yeah.
assuming. And can you give us a brief story or tell us about what your experiences were in New York?
Okay. My mother left of course, we didn't stay with these well-to-do people. My mother moved into an apartment in Manhattan with a distant cousin, her age, who had a daughter my age, and who had a mother, an old mother, she was probably 60, who took care, to me then she was old, who took care of cousin and me, while my mother and her cousin went to work because we had no money. We had $5 when we came. So the only jobs they could get was to be maids. And so both the young women, the mothers, went out and became housemaids. And we kids went to school, and it was it's funny because I remember just a few weeks of not understanding English. It seemed like almost within a few weeks I understood English. I haven't got a memory of, except a very brief one, of not understanding the language. But I felt very much an outcast because my clothes were very different than American children's clothes. I wore high shoes because I had, I don't know, sunken arches or something, and so I wore these high shoes because that's what the doctor in Vienna had said. And we nearly didn't get to the United States because I had chicken pox when we were supposed to leave. And my mother called the last Jewish pediatrician in Vienna, and this was a lady who came over to the house, and my mother said, "Can I travel with her? She's got a high fever, and she's all broken out." And this doctor said, "You go, no matter what condition she's in." And so they got me all dressed up with a sort of a nightgown with a high collar and put stuff on me. And when we had to pass a health inspection to get on the boat to cross the Atlantic. And I kept hiding behind my mother because I knew we could be sent back. And the doctor kept saying, "Come on, little girl, I have to look at you, I have to talk to you." And I wouldn't come out. And my mother said, she's very traumatized by everything. So he said, "Okay."
Well, your mother was quite well aware of what needed to be done.
Oh, my mother was a survivor, yes.
She apparently used her strength.
She was very
to
strong.
get by many things, it appears so. Your father then came in 1944, you said?
Yeah.
And what did he do here? Did he work at all? Was he able to work?
Well, the war was on, and he got a job as a draftsman. What had happened, meanwhile, my mother went from cleaning house to watching children, and when the war broke out, was able to get some work, defense work. So once the war was on, and you could get defense work, things were much better. So then she was doing that, and then she met some people from Vienna, and one of the men was a scientist, and he was developing some very innovative optical equipment. And when my father was a draftsman for a year or two, and then this man went into business with his optical stuff, and my father ended up working for him, and that became extremely successful. It was the first varifocal lens, Zoomar lenses, perhaps you've heard the name. And so my father became part of that, and my parents did very well.
Can you tell us about your education here?
Well, I went to public school and junior high school. I went to junior high school at the edge of Harlem. We lived in Manhattan at 140th Street. And I always am so happy I went to that junior high school because it helped me so much understand prejudice and racism. And because what I discovered in that school was before I didn't have any influence except that my parents would think black people, but then I went to school with black children and made friends, and it turned out that I made friends with kids who had similar homes than I did, who took piano lessons, and whose parents were educated. And I didn't make friends with kids, so it was a social class issue. It wasn't a color issue. And that was a wonderful experience that has been with me for the rest of my life. And then I went to the High School of Commerce, which was a very stupid choice. It's because a boy I liked went there. And my parents didn't know.
Why was it a stupid choice?
Well, because there would have been much, I could have gone to the High School of Music and Art and places where I would have had a better education. I didn't get a particularly good preparation for college there. And my parents didn't know about the educational system, so they just, let me do what I wanted to do. And then I went to NYU, Washington Square College. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write. I loved the radio, and I wanted to be a radio writer. And NYU had a radio program, which I guess today would be called communication. And while I started college at 16 because I got promoted all the time. And in those days, if you got A's, they pushed you up a class, regardless of your social development or your maturity. They just kept pushing you ahead. So I ended up at NYU at 16 and a half. It was 1948, and there were I felt very out of place. There were a lot of veterans coming back on the GI Bill of Rights, and I was a very protected girl. I met my husband, though, at 17, but he was a pre-med student. And we became very good friends and ended up becoming boyfriend and girlfriend and marrying 4 years later. And
what was your involvement in Jewish affairs while you were going to school, whether it be in grade school or in universities?
Absolutely none. The first time I ever entered a synagogue was for the bar mitzvah of the boy of the family that brought us to the United States. That was my first time in a synagogue. And my parents had no interest in joining or educating me. I felt very resentful. I felt all along that I had to have this experience in Vienna because I was a Jew and I didn't know what Jewish meant. And what is it to be a Jew? And then I met my husband at 17 and I became part of his family. His family was Orthodox when he was young. And they became conservative sort of when he was a teenager. And so I began to go to temple with them and to see there was a kosher home and stuff. And my husband my husband was very upset and angry at the orthodoxy. He wanted to run away from it. I wanted to know more about being Jewish, and he wanted not to be Jewish, but he didn't want any of the ritual and any of that. He felt it was hypocritical. The Orthodox rabbi had become conservative when the board paid him because the women wanted to sit with the men. He felt, my husband was very bitter about a lot of it because he believed in it a lot when he was young and then felt very disillusioned. So we eventually compromised and raised our children Reform because we both wanted to have our children. I said my children have to have more of a Jewish religion and training than I have. They can reject it if they want later, but they have to know they have to be educated. And my husband wanted that too.
When did you come to Milwaukee?
In 1976.
And did you become involved in any activity, organizations or Jewish communities?
Well, we joined Temple B'nai Yeshua Emmanuel because our boys had been bar mitzvahed in Rochester, New York, where we had lived before 76, and in a Reform temple. And then we joined Emmanuel because our daughter was 10. And I became a part of the, I don't know, is it called the Next Generation? I wanted to, they were looking for people. I was studying social work, and I was, I think maybe I had my degree already, but I was a co-facilitator in the groups they had for the children of Holocaust survivors. for a while, and then I stopped doing that.
What brought you to Milwaukee?
My husband's work. My husband is a radiologist, and he was a professor of radiology at the University of Rochester. And then an ex-student of his who was at the medical college here told my husband that Mount Sinai is becoming affiliated with the University of with the medical school in Madison, and that so Mount Sinai, a community hospital, needed to become more academically needed academic people to run their departments. And so my husband was put up for the job as chief of radiology, and a very close friend of his also. And so rather than choose one or the other, the two of them said, can we be co-chairs? And that's what happened. So that's how we came here.
What do you see as the present or the future of the Milwaukee Jewish community?
That's hard for me to say because I'm not part of it. None of our children married into the Jewish faith, which was not easy for me, but we have to take the responsibility for the fact that we always had mixed friends. We didn't only have Jewish friends, and we had friends from the temple, but we also had a lot of friends from the university and so forth. And our children grew up with lots of different people, also of different colors and cultures. Our daughter, who was very religious, was part of BBYO, wouldn't eat ham or shrimp for years when she was a teenager, married a Catholic. Now she is raising her kids Jewish, the boys, she's raising her sons Jewish. My two sons ended up, my one son went to Kenyon and had Jewish friends and non-Jewish friends, ended up marrying a Quaker woman, a woman who was a Quaker, whose grandfather was actually an Orthodox Jew, and whose father, something happened in the family, and the father and his sister were placed in a Quaker home for some reason. And then, so he became a Quaker, and that's my daughter-in-law was raised Quaker. And my other son, my middle son, married a Catholic girl who knows more Hebrew and knows the Hebrew songs better than I do, because she's a very respectful, she's a very devout Catholic, and is equally respectful of Jewish religion. So that when we have our we celebrate all Jewish holidays with meals at our house, she can say the brochas better than I can, because she's very respectful of these things.
I'll ask you something that maybe you could answer, maybe you can't. Is there something about yourself that you think no one knows about?
No, as you can tell, I'm pretty open. But let me get back to the Jewish community. I wanted to survive, and I'm now going to try to give talks to the schools, and I'm supportive of the Jewish community. I don't know, maybe people don't know this until recently, but I have a small pension that I get from Vienna because I was deprived of an education because of the Holocaust. So I get about $1,500 a year. And I have never touched that money. I have an endowment fund at the Jewish Federation for that, because I want that to go to other Jewish immigrants and to the Jewish community. So while I'm not a participant actively, I'm certainly supportive, and my husband and I have always supported financially everything Jewish, the Federation and so forth, with money and so forth.
Are there any regrets?
Regrets? About what? About
about your life, about your living it?
No, I've been very fortunate. I've had a very, I can't imagine having had a better life if the Holocaust hadn't happened, because I was so lucky to get out, and my parents were reunited, and they lived well, and they lived into their 90s and came here, and life has been very good to me in spite of this very unpleasant childhood.
Do you have anything else?
I do, actually. I have a couple of follow-ups. Your uncle went to Palestine at the time.
Yeah.
Was there a Zionism in the family, or
No.
was this just an escape?
Escape.
And in following the Holocaust, what was the relationship of your family to Israel with the establishment of the state?
Well, supportive, of course, but
Did you visit?
oh yeah, oh my mother visited the first time when she didn't fly. She took a boat for weeks. I think she visited twice as soon as she could, and she brought food, and I think she brought a small refrigerator on the boat, all kinds of things. And then my husband and I visited, and the kids, and my Israeli family has come back. In fact, my cousin from Israel is coming tomorrow to visit. Yeah, no, I've gone to a couple of their children's wedding. My cousin married a Yemenite, and who was a wonderful family man, very family oriented, and so and we've always supported Israel financially. Yeah.
And then the other question, I know that you're a social worker. Can you describe your process of, balancing your education and work and family life?
I started when my daughter started kindergarten. I started to look for a profession, because what I had studied in college I no longer could do. I had worked at NBC Television in an advertising agency for 2 years after I graduated college, before I got married, and I couldn't go back to that years later. So besides which, I wanted to do something that would be useful to people. I didn't want to be in the entertainment business. So that's why, and a neighbor of mine in Rochester was involved in a preventive mental health project, a research project with children, and I eventually got into that as a paraprofessional and got so turned on by it that I started to go to graduate school.
In Rochester?
In Rochester, yes. And my husband's move came when I was about 6 credits short of my degree, or 8 credits short. So when I came here, I went to UWM, had to repeat a third-year field placement and more courses, but I got my MSW here. And then I fell into a very unusual situation which led me to a professional life that I never expected. I fell, after I graduated, got my MSW, I got it with a major in family therapy. And I realized that I was offered a job at Lakeside Children's Home as a family therapist. And I realized that I have never worked in my field placement. I had never treated a family. And that didn't feel very comfortable to me. So I knew Family Service of Milwaukee had a program for family therapists where you could
Jewish
be
Family Service?
No, it wasn't Jewish families. Where you could, the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy had a program there where you could become a certified family therapist. So I went over there. I graduated in May, and my job was supposed to start in September. And I said, could I get some supervision and pay for some supervision? So, because I didn't want to go into this job never having treated a family. Mm-hmm. So they said, yeah, fine, you know, you have some experience, because I had worked in Rochester. I had worked for 4 years in this project with children. I had done play therapy for 4 years. So they allowed me to do that and gave me a wonderful supervisor. After 2 months of beginning to learn family therapy, I said, I can't do this. I can't take a job. I have to do this 2-year training because I don't feel competent unless, to call myself a family therapist unless I do that. I therefore signed on to this full-time 2-year program to become a family therapist. My supervisor in this program and her husband were interested in developing some very cutting-edge work in family therapy at the time. And when I finished, it was just the time when they opened their own little place, which was going to be a think tank and a training center eventually, and to develop a new brief kind of, a new cutting-edge type of family therapy. And they asked me to join them when I finished, and I did that. And that turned into a world-famous product.
What's the product?
It's called Solution-Focused Brief Therapy.
Solution-Focused Brief Therapy.
And I was part of the group that developed that, and we then began to teach, and we began to travel, because this coincided with managed care beginning to rear its ugly head, and people were looking for briefer therapy. So I fell into a situation which was just mind-expanding and exciting, and it was very exciting. And then having been a founder and developed it, became an expert and began to travel and teach all over the world and write articles, and eventually wrote a book. And now I own my own agency with another woman down here on Albion and Farwell. So, I feel so very fortunate how life has treated me, in spite of my very, very bad beginning, and I would like to give back to that as much as I can.
I have one more question. Do you know what happened to your grandparents?
Yes, yes.
If you don't want to discuss it, you don't have to.
It's okay. My uncle in Israel is married to a woman whose father was a Turkish Jew, and therefore she and her mother had Turkish citizenship. And Hitler in Turkey was an ally of the Germans. So after my mother and I left, my mother's mother died a natural death, but my mother's father and my father's mother and father moved in with this lady because they thought maybe they would be protected in a home of a Turkish citizen. Mm-hmm. And they were for a while, but eventually they all, including the Turkish grandma, ended up in Theresienstadt, and my grandparents were eliminated. But she went from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz to another place and eventually ended up in Israel. So she knew what happened to my grandparents and told us. But otherwise we would have just, we wouldn't have known.
You have no more. Well, we want to thank you very much. It's something that is very important, and these things must continue.
Absolutely.
And so you have done your part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the interview, giving me the opportunity. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you both so much.